Everybody, thanks for watching and welcome to Greek Mythology Volume 3. So, the last couple of volumes we got into just really getting into Greek mythology and, where it stems from. So, a lot of people by now should understand that Greek mythology, as we know it, basically is giving us astrology. It's giving us the planets. It's giving us everything that's dealing with the mind, body, and spirit. Greek mythology, all these characters are characters that represent these things. Mainly, of course, the planets, the astrology, and what have you. We know the moons of Saturn, just about all of them is named after Greek gods. Many of the planets after Greek and Roman gods. So we understand that you had Greek mythology, which later we have Roman mythology, which is all basically piggybacking off Egyptian mythology. So when you get into all that, as we talked about, this is all astrology and really breaking that down and understanding, which we're going to really get into deeply in this video because it's something huge that people is missing when you think about the concept of this Greek mythology and why these stories exist. So we look at these characters and we have all been, taught at some point in our life about the Greek mythology and these Greek characters, and you got to wonder, like, why did they pound this stuff home, throughout school about Greek mythology and these Greek characters? People don't understand DC Comics is based off of Greek mythology. If you watch the Wonder Woman movie, it was talking about Greek mythological things, dealing with Hades and dealing with Ares and dealing with, Zeus, and all this stuff is Greek mythology that we're still seeing today. So it's been pounded into us, and a lot of people don't really get the esoteric understanding. So we know when you look at the astrologers, we look at math, science, astrology, biology even, and everything that's dealing with, intelligent learning that we learn from school on up. It always goes back to Greek people. It goes back to Aristotle and Thales and Pythagoras and so on. But we know that these guys went to the Egyptian mystery schools. They studied in Kemet, which they spoke about themselves. So Kemet and the Egyptians are not given credit for teaching this knowledge and putting this knowledge out. Automatically, this stuff goes back to Greek. And it's one of the things you got to pay attention to with the English language, dealing with Greek and Latin. So when you go and look at the grammatic, they says it was going back to grammatic. People automatically associate that with Germany, which still stems from out of the language stems from out of Greek and Roman mythology, or Greek and Rome languages. So when you start doing the etymology and looking back, you'll understand that it's a Greco-Roman collaboration that really gave us the grammatic language in English, which is why you look at Greek letters, you see English letters like A. Talked about this in That's Game, Bible Christianity Finally Explained. So all of this, bringing us back to Greek, which we know is going to bring us back to Kemet. So understanding this, we understand that what we know today as far as our learning process, we getting from the Greeks, who basically lied and covered up everything. So now, if you do real research, everybody who has went on to study this whole thing and getting into the whole thing with the creation of the Bible. Now, if you're arguing biblical doctrine or biblical religion, especially with Hebrew Israelites, this is what you're getting into when you get into the scholarship of it. So for those of you who have looked, what did you find? You find, because you're trying to prove the authenticity of the Bible, which we cannot, because we're never going to have the originals or be able to prove that they even existed. So what we can prove is, one, if we can find proof that the Jews actually existed during a certain time prior, let's just say 4th century BCE, that they had a legacy and people talked about them, it gives more validity to the Bible itself. So what you had when you start to look, what did you find? You find a bunch of scholars who were trying to prove the existence of Jews. So understand, as I tell the Hebrews, when Kemet fell, part of the Egyptian empire was Israel. It stretched all the way over to Israel. So they came into Israel, they conquered Israel, which was full of African people, Egyptians, black people. I talked about Tunis. I talked about, Tyre or Tyrus. We know it was Africans there. All this was conquered, right? So when they conquered these lands and they started to implement Hellenization, which Hellenization is basically the spreading of this, what we call the Jewish doctrine. So they took these Africans and made them Jews, Hebrews. So when you look, you find these philosophers and researchers, Greeks, trying to prove this existence, right? So that's what you find. There's quite a few expensive books on this whole thing. And it says, Plato, in the creation of the Hebrew Bible, for the first time compares the ancient law collections of the ancient Near East, the Greeks, and the Pentateuch to determine the legal antecedents, which basically means the precursor, for the biblical laws. Following on from his 2006 work, Berosus and Genesis, Benito and Exodus, Merkin takes up his theory that the Pentateuch was written around 270 BCE using Greek sources found at the Library of Alexandria, and applies this to an examination of biblical law codes. A striking number of legal parallels are found between the Pentateuch and Athenian laws, and specifically with those found in Plato's law of circa 350 BCE. Constitutional features in biblical law, Athenian law, and Plato's laws also contain close correspondences. Several genres of biblical law, including the Decalogue, are shown to have striking parallels with Greek legal collections, and the synthesis of narrative and legal context is shown to be compatible with Greek literature. All this evidence points to direct influence from Greek writings, especially Plato's law, on the biblical legal tradition. Finally, it is argued that the creation of the Hebrew Bible took place according to the program found in Plato's laws for creating a legally authorized national ethical literature, reinforcing the importance of this specific Greek text to the authors of the Torah and Hebrew Bible in the early Hellenistic era. This study offers a fascinating analysis of the background of the Pentateuch and will be of interest not only to biblical scholars but also to students of Plato, ancient law, and Hellenistic literary traditions. Now here's basically the review of what one of these researchers wrote about Reed and Merkin's findings. And this is basically what they said to sum it up. It says, the thesis is therefore clear. The Pentateuch is a Greek work inspired by Greek sources. Understand, the Pentateuch is a Greek work inspired by Greek sources. To just piss some Hebrew off if they're watching it. The book is constructed in 6 chapters each, followed by bibliographs relating to that chapter. An index of sources and an index of authors closes the volume. It says, thus, the thesis that the author pursues in this sequel of the first volume is that the Pentateuch in its legal parts is inspired by Platonic sources to which the 70, if you understand letters of Orestes, the 70 Jews, had access in the great Library of Alexandria. The argument is simple and comparative. The greater number of Pentateuchal laws, even if they had some Semitic precursors, seem copied from the Athenian law, or more precisely, the Platonic laws. Beyond this argument, the author proposes that the laws of Plato constitute a new hermeneutical, which basically means interpretation, a new hermeneutical key for the ideology not only of the Pentateuch, but the whole of the Bible. The Bible is the official national literature mandated according to the same instructions of the Platonic laws. If you understand that, that is big. So understand, Merkin, he was real careful in his book to not, say it flat out. He said what he said, and he let the information speak for itself. And if you got enough knowledge, you came to the right conclusions. But you had later scholars come out and say, what he meant. They reviewed the book. And the implications are, well, if this is all true, which it looks, then the Greeks created Christianity, which I've been saying. They created Judaism. It's all bullshit. Now, American doesn't really come straight out and say it, try to make it as if, these people actually exist, because I doubt he want to really get in, on the bad side of Jews who running everything. But it's as if these people existed, and then you could somehow say, well, the Greeks didn't want to put out the truth. So they basically distorted. Like, they want to say that the Hebrews existed, but the Greeks didn't want to put out the truth, so they kind of distorted the information from the Hebrews about, what they actually said, which don't make sense, because if you didn't like it, you wouldn't have put out nothing. You wouldn't even did the information. You would have put out your own stuff. So the story of getting these 72 Hebrew elders to put out this information doesn't make sense. Now, in understanding that you're going to do what they did with this whole creation, they could have done that, which it looks like they did. Go get 70 so-called Hebrews and get them to do this so-called translation just to have a record of it. Now, whoever came up with this whole Black Hebrew Israelite doctrine understands all this. They know, which is why, they don't really want to jump on this. They wouldn't dare read any of those books because they understand the implications. Now, the whole thing is they understand that when you go back and do the research, it all points to white Greeks. But when you leave that little door open saying possibly, this is what they're piggybacking on. Now, this is the reason why King James must be black, as I said. Because if King James is black, then you can say, well, God gave King James the true translation, the real translation. Don't read what these Greeks talk about. Read the King James version, the real translation. Or they'll say, the Masoretic text, because it's in Hebrew. Stuff like this. But what they don't say and what they don't address is, how come your God gave the knowledge to the white man before his chosen people? Think about that. Clearly the Greeks had this information first. So why is it that God gave it to them before his chosen people? Why would he give it to them? Who would change his image and change everything about the book and make all these so-called lies and so on and so forth. But you expect us to take the same stuff that was supposedly created, in deception and believe you on it with no proof. So now understand this, and this is what these Hebrews are not getting. If you don't do the research, you're not going to know this. And this is painstaking research. It is so much. You got to be crazy. You got to be obsessed, which, I am, and I really was back then when I was digging into all this. You got to be, because there's so much, you have to dig into. And if you learn it in truth, you'll figure it out. I'll lab on this later. You'll figure it out. So anybody that's doing research on the Jews, the Hebrews, 4th century BCE, if you're looking for anything, on the Jews prior to 4th century BCE, there's only 4 sources that you can really go to. 4. And of those 4 sources, only one has real tangible, evidence that you can really believe. And he's the only one that everybody really goes to. So this is how you can break this stuff down. This is how you know who's who and who's doing the research. Because anything anybody said besides these 4 people is pseudo. It's bullshit. It's iffy. So these 4 people are the suspect one. I start with him first. Josephus, right? Josephus. Then you have Aristobulus. Then you have Diodorus Siculus, who this is largely about, what Merkabah wrote it. And then you have Hecataeus. Hecataeus and Diodorus is basically the primary people that he's sourcing for this book that Merkabah wrote, because that's who you have to source. If you arguing with somebody about this and they're not citing, which the Hebrews will not, they won't, and you're going to find out why in a second. If they're not citing Hecataeus and Diodorus Siculus, forget it, because it's pseudo. It's pseudo. We're gonna get into this in a second, but understand that. So you have Hecataeus, who is a large part of this book. He was 25 years old when Kemet fell. So he had 25 years of seeing Kemet being ruled by Egyptians. 25 years of that. And I believe he died in 550 BC. So he had 25 years, or that's when Kemet fell, was 550. So he knew, he had knowledge. Hecataeus understood what was going on. He's a historian. Look him up, he's a Greek historian. And he has two very important works that everybody knows about when you start researching this guy, Hecataeus. So you have Yenela, which Yenela basically means genealogy. Yenela Greek means genealogy, right? So Yenela genealogy, and Storia. So Storia is basically your history. So Storia, Greek history, that's where we get story, Storia. Yenela genealogy, that's his book. That's what it translates into. The most important book is his one that's basically on his journey. The journey that he fucking took, supposedly, around the world, which is pronounced Periostos Gamma Sigma. Periostos Gamma Sigma. I gotta say it a couple times to get it out. But it basically means journey around the world. So you have these important books by Hecataeus. And he's known for these books because he supposedly traveled and did this research on these civilizations of people, which is why he must be cited. Now, there are only about 300 or so fragments of these books in existence. And you have Theodorus, who is known for being, a person that had this library of books, of rare books. And supposedly he had probably a more fulfilled book or manuscript of Hecataeus' words. So it was fragments, but probably more complete than what we have today. Now understand, Diodorus Siculus was born, about 400 years after Hecataeus. So we're talking about hundreds of years later that he's referencing Hecataeus and his works, Diodorus, right? So that's one of the important things to understand. When people are going to reference, they're going to Diodorus, who is referencing Hecataeus, who is important, because if you're going to say what somebody said, we need to know who this guy is and what he said exactly. And the thing with Diodorus and his writings, because Diodorus is paraphrasing Hecataeus. He's paraphrasing him because he's not going directly from manuscript, copying what he said specifically. He's paraphrasing from the fragments that he had. Now, as scholars, you have the fragments that all scholars agree upon, that Diodorus cites. These are the fragments that everybody say, these ones is okay, they're authentic, we believe these are real. And you have the fragments that they don't have, that is questionable. And for many reasons, which we'll get into some of them, because they don't know. Just like Diodorus, he speculates a little bit, but he's paraphrasing what's said. So now, the whole thing is, of course, you have Hecataeus, who was born, around the time the Egyptians was ruling. And here's a guy who lived through the rulership of the Egyptians and lived through the conquest of the Persians. Now, if this dude was an historian and he traveled the world, as it says with his books, he's supposed to have traveled the world and everything like that, and did a genealogy and all this, at some point he had to speak to Jews. There's no way he could not have spoken to Jews or Hebrews. He had to have, and he had to have mentioned them. Now, according to Diodorus, he never mentions them. He never says that he spoke to any Jews. In fact, he says that what he heard about the Jews came from the Egyptians, which makes it even more suspect that how could you not have spoken to any Jews? And it says here, let's read. The undisputed fragments of Hecataeus in Diodorus Siculus' library, Book 1, display no awareness of the Pentateuch, while the account of the Jews in the Book 40 is so divergent from the Pentateuch as to guarantee that Hecataeus did not have access to Jewish writings, translated or otherwise. These difficulties are usually overcome by postulating that Hecataeus learned about the Pentateuch from Jewish priests living in Alexandria. But a second difficulty is that in Diodorus Siculus' library, Book 1, Hecataeus repeatedly named Egyptian priests as his sources. Nowhere did he claim to have had contact with Jews. If Hecataeus had contact with Jewish priests or had access to Jewish writings, he would have doubtless have said so to enhance the authority of his account. But Hecataeus made no such claims in undisputed fragments. Third, the detailed information Hecataeus allegedly presented about the Jews in Book 40 was not quoted or utilized by any author from 320 BCE to the time of Posidonius and Diodorus Siculus in the 1st century BCE. That Theophrastus read Hecataeus is certain. Yet, the description of Herodox Jews and Theophrastus on piety markedly differed from the detailed knowledge of Orthodox Judaism in the allegedly Hecataean passage in Book 40. Manetho's dependence on Hecataeus of Abdera is certain, yet his knowledge of the Jews was limited to their location in Jerusalem. That's all they know about them, where they came from. They didn't really know much. 2nd century BCE Alexandrian Jewish writers such as Aristobulus and Pseudo-Aristeas, which the letters of Aristeas is pseudo, and they had already came to the conclusion that Jews wrote this later on. Did extensive research in the classics, including Hecataeus of Abdera, Aegyptica, but failed to discover a single passage in which an early Hellenistic author of Hecataeus' time or earlier quoted Jewish scripture. That so many writers on the Jews who were familiar with Hecataeus knew nothing of the context of Diodorus Siculus' library suggests that the latter passage did not derive from Hecataeus. Meaning it's all bullshit. And you have to understand, this is the foundation evidence of proving the validity of the Bible. This is what you have to go to. The whole thing about the letters of Aristeas, all this stuff, it's all suspect, it's all pseudo. The only real tangible proof is what we have from Diodorus on Hecataeus' supposed writing of, what took place. That he doesn't say he met any Jews or anything like that. So I get Hebrew after Hebrew quoting, Josephus. As if Josephus was this major knowledgeable source who had, real good provable information, where he was always quoting from Aristobulus, which Aristobulus' information was pseudo. And it's even saying here in the sightings. It says down here, Josephus, in conducting a similar search on ancient writings for reference to the Jews, had to resort to the Jewish forgery pseudo-Hecataeus.